You have seen the film. You know the shape of the story. A lonely genius in a hut, a clever machine, a code nobody could break until he broke it, and a country that thanked him by destroying him. If that version is enough for you, I understand, and you are free to go watch something lighter. But there is one detail almost none of the documentaries will tell you, and once you have it, the familiar story does not gain a footnote, it collapses. The thing that actually beat Enigma was not a machine searching faster than any human could. It was a way of reasoning that the leading statisticians of the age had spent 20 years trying to bury, a method they called illegitimate, unscientific, beneath serious work. It won the war in secret. It stayed classified for 30 years. And it is the same method running inside the device in your hand right now. And, if the neuroscience holds, inside the part of you that is deciding whether to believe any of this. So settle in and subscribe or join if you have not, because this channel lives down here in the long dark, where the comfortable version of the story comes apart. There is a Patreon as well, where these same threads, the physics and the math and the history that never fit inside one video, get pulled much further than a single film allows. Stay to the end, because by the time we reach the half-eaten apple beside his bed that no one ever bothered to test, you will understand that the codebreaker, the machine, and your own mind are all running the same algorithm. Let's go back to where this began. The German High Command was not being arrogant. That is the part nobody tells you. When the engineers who designed the Enigma machine told their superiors that the cipher was mathematically unbreakable, they were not boasting, and they were not lying, and they were not making the kind of overconfident mistake that historians love to wag their fingers at after the fact. They had done the arithmetic. The number of ways a single Enigma machine could be set up on any given morning was 159 quintillion, a number with 21 digits. If you built a machine that could test one of those settings every second, and you started it running at the moment the universe began, it would still be working today, and it would still be working 5 trillion years from now, which is more than 300 times the current age of everything that exists. The math was on their side. The math was overwhelmingly, crushingly, almost insultingly on their side. And it fell anyway. Not because someone stole a codebook, although that happened too, and it mattered less than you think. Not because the Germans got sloppy, although they did, and that mattered more than they ever admitted. It fell because a small number of people figured out that you do not have to beat 159 quintillion. You only have to refuse to play the game the way the number wants you to play it. And the strangest thing about how they did it, the thing that has been sitting in plain sight for decades, while everyone told you a simpler story about a brilliant man and a clever machine, is that the core method they used was a way of thinking that the most powerful mathematicians in the world had spent the previous 20 years trying to kill. I want to be precise about this, because it is the spine of everything that follows, and because the version you have probably absorbed gets it slightly wrong in a way that makes the real story disappear. The popular version says Alan Turing broke Enigma. The popular version says he built a machine that cracked the code and shortened the war and was rewarded with persecution and an early death, and that a vengeful establishment then buried the evidence of what he had done. Almost every piece of that is either incomplete or actively false, and the true version is not smaller than the legend. It is larger, it is darker, and it ends in a place that should genuinely unsettle you, because the method that broke the unbreakable cipher is the same method that is, right now, running inside the device you are listening to this on, weighing probabilities, updating its beliefs, deciding what you are most likely to want next. The thing they tried to suppress did not just win the war, it came back. It is everywhere. and almost nobody has connected those two facts. So this is not really a story about a code. It is a story about a kind of reasoning that was treated as heresy, that was classified the moment it proved itself, that was kept secret for 30 years, and that we are only now beginning to understand was a claim about how all thinking works, including yours. Let me show you how the impossible number actually worked, because you cannot feel the size of what these people did until you feel the size of what they were up against. An Enigma machine looked like a typewriter that had eaten another typewriter. You pressed a key, and instead of printing a letter, a lamp lit up behind a different letter on a board above the keyboard. That was the whole interface. Press A, maybe G lights up. Press A again, and this time R lights up, because the machine had already changed its internal state. That is the first thing that made it monstrous. It was not a code in the sense of a fixed substitution, where A always becomes G. It was a cipher that rewrote its own substitution alphabet after every single keystroke, so that the same letter pressed twice in a row would almost never come out the same way twice. Inside, the current from the key traveled through a set of rotating wheels called rotors. Each rotor was a disk with 26 electrical contacts on one face and 26 on the other, wired across the inside in a scrambled order, so that current entering at one position came out somewhere else entirely. The German army machine used 3 rotors in a row, chosen from a set of 5, and the order you put them in mattered, which already gives you 60 possible arrangements. Each rotor could be set to start at any of 26 positions, and because there were 3 of them, that is 26 times 26 times 26, or 17,576 starting positions. After each keystroke, the right-hand rotor clicked forward 1 step, and when it completed a full revolution, it kicked the middle rotor forward, and the middle rotor eventually kicked the left one, exactly like the odometer in a car. So the wiring the current passed through was different on every key press. That is why frequency analysis, the ancient technique of counting which letters appear most often, was useless. There was no stable pattern to count. But the rotors were not even the main event. After the current passed through all 3 rotors, it hit a component called the reflector, a fixed wheel at the end of the stack that sent the current back through the 3 rotors a second time by a completely different path, and then back out to light the lamp. And before any of that, before the current ever reached the rotors, it passed through a plug board on the front of the machine, where the operator could connect pairs of letters with cables, swapping them. Connect A to J with a cable, and every A becomes a J, and every J becomes an A before the rotors even see it, and again on the way out. The standard military setup used 10 cables, connecting 20 of the 26 letters into 10 swapped pairs. Here is where the number explodes. The number of ways to choose 10 pairs out of 26 letters is 150 trillion. Just the plug board. Just the cables on the front of the machine. That single component contributes more possibilities than the rotors and their positions combined, by orders of magnitude. When you multiply everything together, the rotor choices and orders and starting positions and ring settings and that monstrous plug board, you arrive at the figure the Germans trusted their lives to. 159 quintillion settings, changed every 24 hours at midnight, so that whatever you had figured out yesterday was worthless today. For scale, there are estimated to be around 10 to the 80th atoms in the observable universe. The Enigma key space is nowhere near that. It is much smaller, but it does not need to be the size of the universe. It only needs to be larger than anything a human being or a room full of human beings could search by hand before the setting changed at midnight and erased their progress. And it was. By an almost unimaginable margin, it was. The Germans looked at that number and concluded, reasonably, that no human effort and no machine then conceivable could ever find the right setting in time to matter. They were correct about the search. What they failed to imagine was that someone would simply refuse to search. That refusal has a history, and the history does not start with Alan Turing. It starts in a country that was about to be erased from the map, with 3 young men whose names have been almost completely scrubbed from the story you were told, and whose work was so far ahead of everyone else's that the British, when they finally saw it, did not entirely believe it was real. Before we get there, I need to plant something, and I am going to ask you to hold it in the back of your mind for the next 2 hours, because it is going to come back at the very end, and it is going to mean something different than it means now. The method that eventually broke the naval version of Enigma, the version that was strangling Britain to death across the Atlantic, was not a method for searching faster. It was a method for changing your mind in the correct amount based on evidence. That sounds almost too simple to be powerful. It sounds like common sense. And the reason it does not sound like a revolutionary mathematical weapon is that we have spent the 70 years since the war slowly forgetting how violently the experts of the time rejected it. There was a war inside mathematics about whether this kind of reasoning was even legitimate, and it ran underneath the war you have heard about. And the people fighting it could not tell anyone which side had just been proven right. Remember that. We will come back to it when it has teeth. For now, go to Poland. The year is 1932. A 27-year-old mathematician named Marian Rejewski was working in a converted bank vault in Warsaw, employed by the Polish Cipher Bureau. And he had just been handed a problem that the French and the British had both already given up on as hopeless. The Germans were using Enigma. The Poles, sitting directly between Germany and the Soviet Union, with a very clear sense of what the next decade was going to bring, could not afford to give up on it. So they did something that nobody else had thought to do. They put a mathematician on it. This sounds obvious now. It was not obvious then. Codebreaking in the early 20th century was the domain of linguists and puzzle enthusiasts, people who were good at anagrams and crosswords, and who thought about ciphers as a kind of literary game. The idea that the German military cipher was, underneath all its mechanical complexity, a problem in the theory of permutation groups. A piece of pure abstract algebra had not occurred to the professionals who were supposed to know better. Rejewski saw it almost immediately, because Rejewski had been trained in exactly the branch of mathematics that the machine had accidentally turned itself into. What he understood was this: every setting of the Enigma machine defines a permutation of the alphabet, a specific rule for shuffling 26 letters into 26 other letters. And the way the German operators were using the machine in those early years gave Rejewski a tiny crack to work with. To send a message, an operator first had to tell the receiver which rotor positions to use for that particular message. The procedure for doing this involved typing a short 3-letter key twice in a row at the start of every message, enciphered under the day's general setting. Typing it twice was meant to guard against garbling. What it actually did was hand Rejewski a relationship between the first letter and the fourth, the second and the fifth, the third and the sixth, across every message sent that day. Hundreds of messages, hundreds of examples of the same hidden permutation, viewed from slightly different angles. And here Rejewski did something that I genuinely think is one of the most beautiful pieces of applied mathematics in the 20th century, and which has been reduced, in the popular telling, to a footnote if it is mentioned at all. He proved a theorem about what happens when you multiply 2 permutations of a certain kind together. The detail that matters is that the structure of the result, the pattern of cycles it breaks into, is forced. It cannot be anything the cipher designer wants. It carries a fingerprint of the underlying wiring, no matter how the operator tried to hide it. People have called this the theorem that won the war, and while no single thing won the war, the phrase points at something real. Rejewski found a mathematical law that the machine could not violate, and he used that law to reach inside a sealed box he had never opened and reconstruct the wiring of the rotors he had never seen. From nothing but intercepted messages and the procedure the Germans were forced to follow, he worked out the internal electrical connections of a machine that was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the German state. By the end of 1932, the Poles were reading Enigma. Let me say that again so the timeline lands properly, because it rearranges everything. 7 years before the war began, before Alan Turing had written a single word about codebreaking, before Bletchley Park existed as anything but a country house, a handful of Polish mathematicians were quietly reading the secret communications of the German military. And they kept reading them, on and off, for the next 6.5 years, building machines to automate the work. Machines they called Bombe, the Polish word for bombs, possibly named after a popular ice cream dessert, and possibly after the ticking sound they made as they ran. 6 of them, clicking through possibilities in a Warsaw office, while the rest of Europe assured itself that the danger was exaggerated. But mathematics that works against a fixed target does not stay working when the target moves. And the target was about to move. On the 15th of December 1938, the Germans began issuing 2 additional rotors, bringing the set to 5, which meant the rotor order was no longer one of 6 possibilities, but one of 60. And a few weeks later, on the 1st of January 1939, they increased the number of plugboard cables. Overnight, the Polish methods would have required roughly 10 times the machinery they actually possessed. They were a small bureau in a country that was months away from being invaded from 2 directions at once. They did not have 10 times the machinery. They did not have 10 times anything. The war inside the cipher had escalated, and Poland could no longer keep pace alone. So they did the most generous thing in the entire history of intelligence. And it is a thing that almost no intelligence service before or since has been willing to do. They gave it all away. In late July of 1939, weeks before the German tanks crossed the border, the Polish Cipher Bureau invited French and British representatives to a meeting in the Kabaty Woods at Pyry, just south of Warsaw. And there, in a secret facility, they showed their allies everything: the reconstructed wiring, the theorems, the Bombe, the sheets of perforated paper they used to strip away the plugboard. And then they did something that left the British delegation, by their own later accounts, somewhere between astonished and ashamed. They handed each delegation a complete working replica of a military Enigma machine built in Poland that the British had been told for years was impossible to reconstruct. The man leading the British side was a veteran codebreaker named Dilly Knox, who had been banging his head against Enigma without success, and who reportedly sat in near silence on the journey, absorbing the fact that a team he had quietly underestimated had solved the problem he could not. 6 weeks later, Poland was gone. The mathematicians fled south through Romania as their country was crushed between Germany and the Soviet Union, deliberately destroying their own equipment and papers as they ran so that nothing would fall into German hands. They would spend the rest of the war in France and then in exile, doing lower-level cipher work, never told what became of the gift they had given, never brought to Bletchley Park, never allowed inside the operation their breakthrough had made possible. Rejewski did not learn the full scope of what his work had enabled until the 1970s, when the secret finally began to come out. He died in 1980, a man who had reached into a sealed machine with pure algebra and read the mind of an empire, and who spent his post-war years working as an accountant in a cable factory, in the city of bit ghosts, his name known to almost no one. That pattern, the one where the person who actually does the impossible thing slips out of the story while someone else becomes the legend, is going to repeat in this script more than once. Keep count. It is not an accident, and by the end I want you to see the mechanism behind it, because the mechanism is the actual subject of everything I am telling you. But the Poles had not solved the problem the British were about to face. They had solved the early version, the version with the doubled message key and the lighter plug board. And the Germans were closing exactly those weaknesses. The gift from Pyrie was not a finished answer, it was a starting line. And the man who walked up to that starting line was about to throw out the entire approach that had worked for Poland and replace it with something stranger, something that did not try to exploit the operator's procedure at all. Something that went after the machine through its one permanent, unfixable, fatal flaw. To understand that flaw, you have to understand a mistake the designers made that they never recognized as a mistake. Because from where they stood it looked like a feature. It looked like the thing that made the machine convenient. And it was the thing that killed it. The flaw was the reflector. That wheel at the end of the rotor stack. The one that sent the current back through the machine for a second pass. The designers added it for a genuinely useful reason. Because the current went in and came back out along a symmetrical path, the same machine setting that enciphered a message would also decipher it. The receiver did not need a separate decoding machine or a separate procedure. He set his Enigma to the same configuration as the sender, typed the gibberish he had received, and the plain text lit up letter by letter. One machine, one setting, both directions. Elegant, convenient, and catastrophic. In a way that took years for anyone to weaponize, and that the Germans never fully accepted even after the war was over. Because of how the reflector was wired, connecting the 26 letters into 13 fixed pairs and bouncing the current back, the machine had a property that sounds harmless and is in fact a gaping wound. No letter could ever be enciphered as itself. Press A. And the lamp that lights could be any letter in the alphabet, except A. Ever, under any setting, on any day, with any rotors in any order and any plugboard cables installed, an A would never, ever come out as an A. The current physically could not make that trip. The reflector would have had to wire a letter back to its own contact, which it never did, because that would have created a short circuit that defeated the entire point of the design. Now hold that in your hand and feel how strange it is that a security feature created an absolute, exploitable certainty. In a good cipher, you want everything to be possible. You want the enemy to be unable to rule anything out. The Enigma handed its enemies a permanent rule they could rely on completely. There was a thing that could never happen, and a thing that can never happen is a key, if you are clever enough to figure out what door it opens. Here is the door. Suppose you intercept a line of enciphered German, a string of letters that means nothing, and suppose you have a good guess about a few words of the plain text hiding underneath it. The codebreakers called such a guess a crib. The Germans, being a disciplined military bureaucracy, were a magnificent source of cribs, because they sent the same kinds of messages at the same times in the same formats. Weather reports every morning. A unit that had nothing to report would dutifully send a message saying it had nothing to report. The phrase keine besonderen Ereignisse, meaning no special occurrences, turning up so reliably that it became a standing joke. One Italian outpost in the desert sent the same weather observations so faithfully that the codebreakers came to depend on it. There is a story, probably polished in the retelling but pointing at something true, of a forward position whose only purpose seemed to be radioing back that there was, once again, nothing to report, providing a perfect crack of known text every single day. So you have your crib, a guessed word or phrase, and you have the enciphered line, and you want to know where in that line the crib actually sits. And this is where the reflector flaw turns into a scalpel. You slide your crib along underneath the ciphertext, position by position, and at each position you check a single thing. Does any letter of your crib line up underneath the same letter in the ciphertext? Because if it does, that position is impossible. It is ruled out completely, with total certainty, because no letter can encipher to itself. If your crib has an E sitting directly beneath an E in the cipher, the crib cannot go there. Full stop. No further thought required. In practice, this one rule eliminated the large majority of possible positions almost instantly, leaving only a handful where the crib could legally fit. From a problem with countless possibilities, the reflector flaw alone narrowed you down to a few candidates before you had done any real work at all. The Germans had built a machine that announced, with every message, a long list of places its secrets definitely were not, and once you knew where the crib probably sat, you had something priceless. You had a stretch of ciphertext where you knew both the input and the output. You knew that this particular plain letter, at this particular position, had been turned into that particular cipher letter by the machine, at whatever its setting was that day. You had captured the machine in the act. Alan Turing arrived at Bletchley Park the day after Britain declared war, the 4th of September 1939, a 27-year-old Cambridge fellow who had already done something most mathematicians do not manage in a lifetime, and who almost nobody at the time understood the importance of. We will come back to what he had done in 1936, because it is the hinge the entire ending turns on, and because it is the reason this whole story is ultimately not about the war at all. For now, what matters is that Turing looked at the Enigma problem and made a decision that separated him from the Polish approach entirely. The Poles had attacked the operator's procedure, the doubled key. The Germans were busy closing that hole. Turing decided to ignore the procedure completely and attack the machine itself, through the crib, through that captured moment where input and output were both known. He wanted a method that would keep working, no matter how the Germans changed their operating rules, because it depended only on the physics of the machine and the predictability of military language, neither of which the enemy could easily change. The machine he designed to do it was called the Bombe, taking the name from the Polish Bombe in tribute, though it worked on a completely different principle. And I want to correct something here, because it is one of the most common errors people carry about this entire subject, and correcting it is going to make you better informed than almost everyone who thinks they know this story. The bombe was not a computer. It did not calculate. It did not store a program. The thing most people are picturing when they imagine Turing's code-breaking machine. The room-sized rack of valves with paper tape whirring through it is Colossus, which was a genuine programmable electronic computer, and which had absolutely nothing to do with breaking Enigma. Colossus was built later by a different man to attack a completely different and far more sophisticated German cipher used for messages between Hitler and his generals. Conflating the two is the single most frequent mistake in popular accounts of Bletchley Park, including some that won awards. The bombe that broke Enigma was electromechanical. It was a deduction engine. It did not search for the answer by trying everything. It searched for contradictions and used them to throw away enormous numbers of possibilities at once. Here is the logic, and it is worth slowing down for, because it is genuinely one of the most elegant ideas of the war, and it is almost always skipped. From your crib, the stretch where you know both plain and ciphertext, you can build a kind of diagram. You know that at position 1, the letter A in the plain text became, say, the letter T in the cipher. You know that at position 4, that same T in the plane became an E. You can chain these relationships together. Sometimes they loop back on themselves, forming a closed circle of letters. A connects to T connects to E connects back to A. These loops were the gold. Because the Enigma is its own inverse, those loops impose conditions so tight that they let you test a hypothesis and watch it destroy itself. The bomb worked by assuming. It would guess a rotor configuration and a single plugboard connection, say, that the letter A was plugged to the letter R. Then it would follow the electrical consequences of that one assumption all the way around the loop in the crib at lightning speed through banks of rotating drums that mimicked the wiring of Enigma rotors. If the assumption was wrong, the consequences would contradict themselves. The chain would imply that A was plugged to R and also, simultaneously, plugged to something else, which is impossible, since each letter gets only one cable. The moment the bomb detected that contradiction, it did not just reject the single guess. It rejected the entire family of settings that depended on it, all at once, and clicked forward to the next. It was not asking, is this the answer? It was asking, can this possibly not be the answer? And discarding everything that could not survive. Out of 159 quintillion possibilities, the bomb was a machine for igniting them in bulk and watching almost all of them burn, leaving only the few candidates that did not contradict themselves to be checked by hand. The first bomb, named Victory, was installed at Bletchley Park on the 18th of March 1940. And it worked, in the sense that the logic was sound. But it was painfully slow, and it produced too many false alarms, settings that survived the contradiction test by luck without being correct, forcing the code breakers to chase down dead ends. It needed cribs with multiple loops to narrow things sufficiently, and good multi-loop cribs were not always available. The method was real, but it was fragile, and at that early stage of the war, with France about to fall and the situation turning desperate, fragile was not good enough. What rescued it was a second mind, and this is another name the legend tends to swallow whole. Gordon Welchman was a mathematician who had been assigned almost as an afterthought to think about the broader traffic analysis side of the operation, and who independently worked his way to many of the same insights Turing had reached. But Welchman added one piece that multiplied the bomb's power enormously, and he added it from a simple observation about the plugboard that everyone else had walked past. The plugboard connections were reciprocal. If A was plugged to R, then R was plugged to A. It was the same cable. There was no separate fact to learn. Knowing one direction gave you the other for free. Welchman realized that this reciprocity could be wired directly into the bomb in the form of an additional component he called the diagonal board, a grid of wiring that automatically propagated every plugboard deduction in both directions and fed it back into the machine's reasoning. The effect was dramatic. Now a single assumption did not just travel around one loop. Its consequences spread sideways through the whole network of letters, generating far more contradictions far faster, so that wrong settings collapsed almost the instant they were tried. The diagonal board meant the bomb could succeed with shorter cribs, with fewer loops, sometimes with no loops at all. It turned a fragile prototype into an industrial weapon. There is an account from Welchman himself of the moment he brought the idea to Turing. Welchman wrote that Turing was incredulous at first, that he did not believe the simple addition could possibly do what Welchman claimed. But when Turing studied the diagram, he saw it. And according to Welchman, he became as excited about it as Welchman was. I find that small scene worth sitting with. Two of the finest mathematical minds of the century, in a hut in the English countryside with the war going badly, and one of them has to talk the other into believing that a piece of his own machine could be that much better than he thought. The people who do this work are not omniscient. They doubt. They miss things. They talk each other into seeing. And the difference between that diagonal board existing and not existing was, very plausibly, measured in human lives at a scale we will get to. With the diagonal board, the improved bombe, sometimes called Agnes or Agnes, came into service in August of 1940. And from there, the program scaled into something enormous. By the end of the war in Europe, there were around 210 bombs in Britain, spread across several sites, 100 at Eastcote, 75 at Stanmore, the rest scattered to reduce the risk of a single bomb destroying the whole effort. They were tended around the clock by nearly 2,000 women of the Women's Royal Naval Service, the Wrens, who ran the machines, wired the menus, and recorded the stops, and who were told almost nothing about what their work meant or accomplished. Each bombe was about 7 feet wide and weighed about a ton, and contained the wiring equivalent of 36 Enigma machines, all running at once, around 12 miles of wire packed inside it, the drums on the front spinning and stopping, day and night, for years. So the Army and Air Force Enigma was, by the middle of 1940, regularly breakable. Not always, not instantly, not every key on every day, but reliably enough to change the course of campaigns. You might think that would be the climax of the story, the moment the impossible number was beaten and the good guys won. It was not, because there was another Enigma, a harder one, used by the one branch of the German military that was, at that exact moment, coming closer to defeating Britain than any army ever did. The German Navy. The U-boats. The wolf packs in the Atlantic that were sinking British ships faster than Britain could build them, and that were a few months of unbroken success away from starving the country into surrender. And the naval Enigma did not yield to the bomb alone. It was protected by extra rotors and tighter procedures, and breaking it required something more than logic and contradiction. It required Turing to invent a way of measuring belief itself. It required the method nobody believed. To understand why the naval problem was a different order of nightmare, you have to understand what was happening on the water, because the abstract mathematics only matters once you feel the bodies attached to it. In the spring of 1941, German submarines were sinking around 500,000 tons of Allied shipping in a single month. 500,000 tons. Ships carrying food, fuel, weapons, and men to the bottom of the ocean faster than the shipyards of an entire empire could replace them. Britain is an island. It imported most of what it needed to live and almost everything it needed to fight. Winston Churchill wrote later that the only thing that ever really frightened him during the entire war was the U-boat peril. Not the bombing of London, not the threat of invasion, the submarines. Because the submarines were a math problem, and the math was losing. The U-boats hunted in coordinated groups the Germans called wolf packs, strung out across the convoy routes, talking to each other and to their headquarters constantly by radio, all of it enciphered on naval Enigma. If you could read that traffic, you would know where the wolf packs were waiting, and you could route the convoys around them, through the empty parts of the ocean, and the ships would simply not be where the submarines were. The difference between reading and not reading naval Enigma was, very directly, the difference between a convoy arriving and a convoy being slaughtered. It was the most consequential cryptographic problem of the war, and it sat in a hut at Bletchley called Hut 8, and Hut 8 was run by Alan Turing. The naval machine was meaner than the army's. The German Navy drew its 3 rotors from a set of 8 rather than 5, and it used additional rotors in the 4th position later on, and its operators were better disciplined, less prone to the lazy habits that gave the army's traffic away. The clean crib attacks that worked elsewhere were much harder to mount. Turing needed a way to do the one thing the bomb could not do efficiently on its own, which was to figure out, before committing scarce bomb time, which rotors were even in the machine and roughly where they were set, so that the bombs were not wasted grinding through hopeless configurations. He needed to take a vast number of candidate possibilities and, using fragmentary and uncertain evidence, sort them from most likely to least likely, and concentrate the expensive machinery on the top of the list. What he built to do this was a procedure called Banburismus, named after the town of Banbury, about 30 miles away, where the long sheets of paper it required were printed. And Banburismus is the heart of this entire story, because Banburismus was not logic. The bomb was logic. The bomb dealt in certainty. In this is impossible, throw it away. Banburismus dealt in something the mathematics of the era considered almost disreputable. It dealt in degrees of belief. It asked, given this scrap of evidence, how much more likely is this hypothesis than that one? And it answered with a number. And it accumulated those numbers across many scraps of evidence until belief in one answer grew overwhelming. It was a machine for changing your mind by precisely the right amount, no more and no less, in response to each new clue. Let me make this concrete, because the abstraction hides how radical it was. Suppose you have two enciphered naval messages, and you suspect they were sent on the same or nearby machine settings. If they were, then where the underlying German plain texts happen to share letters, the cipher texts will show a faint statistical echo, a slightly higher rate of coincidences than pure chance would produce, because the same machine state was acting on both. The codebreakers would print the two messages on long sheets, the Banburies punch holes for each letter, and slide them over one another, looking for positions where the holes lined up more often than random chance allowed. A real alignment produced a small excess of coincidences. Noise produced nothing. The signal was weak. A single coincidence told you almost nothing. The art was in adding up many weak signals into a strong conclusion, and to do that correctly, you needed a way to measure exactly how much each weak signal was worth. Turing invented the unit. He called it the ban, again after Banbury, and a tenth of a ban he called the deciban. A ban was a measure of the weight of evidence, specifically the logarithm of how much more probable the evidence made one hypothesis compared to another. Each scrap of evidence was worth some number of decibans, for or against a given guess. And the beautiful thing about working in logarithms is that evidence simply adds. You do not multiply probabilities together and watch them shrink into incomprehensibly tiny decimals. You add up decibans, like keeping a running score, and when the score for a hypothesis climbed past a threshold, you acted on it. The deciban, his colleagues noted, was chosen to be roughly the smallest change in the weight of evidence that a human being can actually perceive as meaningful, which tells you that Turing was not just doing abstract mathematics. He was building an instrument calibrated to human judgment, a way of making the intuition of an experienced codebreaker explicit, quantified, and teachable. If any of this sounds familiar, if the phrase weight of evidence or the idea of accumulating support for competing hypotheses rings a faint bell from somewhere in modern life, hold on to that feeling. You are hearing the future. Turing was doing by hand in 1941, with paper sheets and a unit named after a market town, the exact thing that the recommendation system on every platform you use does billions of times a second today. He was doing what spam filters do when they weigh the words in an email. He was doing what a medical diagnostic algorithm does when it combines test results into a probability of disease. He was reasoning the way the machines that now shape your daily life reason. and he was doing it 3/4 of a century before they existed, in secret, to find submarines. We will come back to that. It is going to be the whole point. For now, I just want you to register that the method felt strange and improvised and almost too clever in 1941, and feels like plain common engineering sense today. And the distance between those two reactions is the distance this story is going to travel. Because here is the part the legend leaves out entirely. The part that makes the title's claim about a method nobody believed into something deeper and truer than it first appears. The way of reasoning Turing used has a name. It is called Bayesian inference, after Thomas Bayes, an 18th century English clergyman whose theorem describes mathematically how a rational mind should update its beliefs when new evidence arrives. You start with some prior estimate of how likely something is. Evidence comes in. You revise the estimate by a precise amount that depends on how well the evidence fits each possibility. The revised belief becomes your new prior, and you do it again with the next piece of evidence, and again forever, getting steadily closer to the truth. It is, arguably, the correct definition of what it means to learn from experience. And at the time Turing was using it to hunt U-boats, it was, in the world of professional statistics, very close to forbidden. This is the friction at the center of everything, and I am not going to soften it, because softening it would be a lie about how science actually works. For the first half of the 20th century, the dominant figures in statistics had largely banished Bayesian reasoning from respectable practice. The towering figure was Ronald Fisher, probably the most influential statistician who ever lived, a man whose methods became the bedrock of how experiments are analyzed in biology, medicine, and the social sciences to this day. And Fisher was contemptuous of what he and others called inverse probability, the Bayesian approach of assigning probabilities to hypotheses based on prior belief. To Fisher and the school that followed him, the idea that you would start with a subjective prior, a number representing how strongly you believed something before seeing the data, was an offense against objectivity. Science was supposed to deal in frequencies, in what happens over many repeated trials, not in one person's degree of conviction. The Bayesian framework was treated, in much of academic statistics, as a kind of embarrassing relic, mathematically suspect, philosophically naive, the sort of thing a serious researcher had outgrown. So consider the situation precisely, because it is genuinely extraordinary. At the exact moment in history when the established authorities of mathematical statistics had agreed that Bayesian reasoning was not a legitimate way to do science, that same reasoning was being used in total secrecy by some of the best mathematicians in Britain to perform one of the most consequential analytical feats in human history. The method the experts had declared illegitimate was, behind a wall of official secrets, quietly saving the country. And the people who knew this, who had the single most powerful possible counter-argument to the statistical orthodoxy of their age, sitting in their hands as classified proof, were forbidden by law from ever mentioning it. They could not publish. They could not point to the U-boats they had found and say, "Look what inverse probability did." They had to sit in post-war academic seminars and listen to colleagues explain why Bayesian methods did not really work, and say nothing. I want to be fair and precise here, because this audience deserves precision, and because overstating the case would cheapen it. It is not that every individual at Bletchley distrusted the method. Inside Hut 8, the people doing the work could see that it worked, and they trusted it because the submarines kept turning up where the decibans said they would. The disbelief was not in the hut. The disbelief was in the discipline. It was in the textbooks, the journals, the university departments, the entire surrounding intellectual world that had decided this kind of reasoning was beneath serious mathematics, and that would have scoffed at Turing's decibel as amateur hour if it had ever been allowed to see it. The method nobody believed was a method an entire field had spent decades teaching its students to disbelieve, vindicated in a place where the vindication had to stay buried. That is a stranger and lonelier kind of being right than the legend's simple tale of a misunderstood genius. Turing was not misunderstood. He was unmentionable. And there was one man at Bletchley who would spend the rest of his life carrying that grievance into the open, long after the war, becoming one of the most important reasons Bayesian methods eventually came back from the dead. His name was Irving John Good, known to everyone as Jack Good, and he was Turing's statistical assistant in Hut 8, a young man who watched the master at work and absorbed not just the techniques, but the conviction behind them. Good went on to a long career and became a tireless, sometimes lonely champion of Bayesian reasoning through the decades when it was still unfashionable, writing and arguing and slowly helping to drag the field back toward the approach he had seen win the war, and could not, for years, fully explain why he trusted so completely. Good is also going to matter at the very end of this story for a completely different reason, one that has nothing to do with submarines and everything to do with what comes after human beings stop being the smartest things on the planet. Remember the name, Jack Good. He is going to say something, decades from where we are now in the story, that will make the hair on your arms stand up, once you know what Turing had already started building. Because the deepest thing about Banburismus, the thing that turns this from a war story into something that should follow you home, is what it implies about the nature of thinking itself. Turing did not invent a trick for breaking ciphers. He built a working model of how a rational mind ought to operate under uncertainty. Take in evidence. Weigh it. Update, repeat. He had reduced reasoning to a procedure, an algorithm, a series of mechanical steps that produced better and better beliefs without requiring any flash of insight or genius at any individual step. And a man who has just proven that reasoning can be reduced to mechanical steps is a man standing very close to a much larger and much more disturbing idea. If reasoning is just a procedure, then a machine can do it. And if a machine can do it, then the thing you do when you think, the thing that feels so much like the center of who you are, might be nothing more than a procedure too. Turing was not a stranger to that idea. He had already had it, years before the war, in the most abstract form imaginable. He had already invented the machine that thinks. He just had not told anyone yet what he suspected it really meant. Before we follow that idea into the dark, I owe you the rest of the war, because the implications do not land unless you know what the method actually bought and what it cost to keep it hidden. And the war handed Hut 8 a catastrophe almost as soon as the naval problem started to yield. For most of 1941, after the captures of crucial codebooks and equipment from German vessels, including material seized from the submarine U-110 in May of that year and from German weather ships in the North Atlantic, Hut 8 was reading naval Enigma well enough to reroute convoys around the wolf packs. Merchant shipping losses, which had been ruinous, fell by more than 2/3 in the second half of that year. The Decibans were finding the submarines. Ships that would have been sunk were arriving in port instead, full of men who did not drown because a sheet of punched paper in an English hut had quietly moved their convoy 200 miles to the south. Nobody on those ships ever knew. That is worth holding on to. The people whose lives this saved went to their graves, most of them, with no idea that they had been saved at all, or by whom, or how. And then, on the 1st of February 1942, the German Navy did the thing Turing had been dreading. They introduced a new naval Enigma with a fourth rotor, used by the Atlantic U-boats, and Hut 8 went dark. The codebreakers called the new cipher Shark, and for most of 1942, they could not read it. 10 months of blackout. And those 10 months were among the worst of the entire Battle of the Atlantic. With the convoys once again blind to where the wolf packs lay, shipping losses surged back to catastrophic levels. The tonnage going to the bottom climbed month after month through that year toward figures that threatened again to break the country's ability to keep fighting. The blackout was not an abstraction. It was a direct, measurable rise in the number of ships destroyed and men killed, and it was caused by a single additional rotor. That is how fine the margin was. One wheel, and the country slid back toward the edge of starvation. What broke Shark was not pure mathematics this time, but raw, fatal courage. On the 30th of October 1942, in the Mediterranean, a damaged German submarine, U-559, was forced to the surface and abandoned. 3 British sailors swam to the sinking boat and climbed inside to retrieve its Enigma codebooks as the sea poured in. 2 of them, Lieutenant Tony Fasson and able seaman Colin Grazier, were still inside passing documents up through the hatch when the submarine went under. They drowned. A 16-year-old canteen assistant named Tommy Brown, who had lied about his age to join the Navy, survived by scrambling clear at the last second with the final batch of papers. The documents those men died to recover gave Hut 8 the foothold it needed to break back into Shark in December of 1942. The mathematics was the engine, but the mathematics needed fuel. And sometimes the fuel was the bodies of teenagers in a flooding submarine in the dark. I think it dishonors them to tell the clean version where genius alone saved the day. Genius needed the codebooks, and the codebooks cost 3 lives, 2 of them lost completely, so that messages neither man would ever read could be understood. So how much did all of it matter, in the end? This is where you have to be careful, because the honest answer involves estimates, and I would rather give you the real uncertainty than a confident number that falls apart under scrutiny. The most authoritative figure comes from Sir Harry Hinsley, the official historian of British wartime intelligence, a man who had actually worked at Bletchley and who spent decades afterward studying exactly this question. Hinsley's considered conclusion, stated in a lecture he gave at Bletchley Park in 1993, was that the work there shortened the war by, in his words, not less than 2 years, and probably by 4 years. 2 to 4 years. Hinsley was the first to stress how difficult such counterfactual history is, how many things would have had to unfold differently, and he was not a man given to inflation. He was, if anything, conservative by temperament, and he concluded that the code-breaking removed somewhere between 2 and 4 years from a conflict that was killing people at a rate that is hard to hold in the mind. The historian Jack Copeland took Hinsley's estimate and did the grim downstream arithmetic. Across the years of European fighting, deaths ran at something on the order of 7 million per year when you count military and civilian losses together. If breaking the U-boat cipher and the rest of the Bletchley effort shortened the war by 2 to 4 years, then the lives not lost, the people who were not killed because the fighting ended sooner, plausibly numbered somewhere between 14 and 21 million. I want to be clear that this is an extrapolation built on an estimate, not a body count. It cannot be precise. But even the lowest defensible end of that range, even if you slash it in half out of caution, describes a quantity of human life preserved that has almost no parallel in the history of any single analytical project. A way of reasoning that an entire academic discipline had dismissed as illegitimate, used in a hut in Buckinghamshire, may have meant the difference between life and death for a number of people larger than the population of many countries. And the people who did it could not say so. For 30 years, they could not say a single word. But the secret had 2 locks, not one, and the second lock is the one almost nobody talks about, because it lives inside the minds of the people who were being beaten. The British could keep the secret. That much you can understand. What is harder to understand and far more unsettling once you do is that the Germans helped keep it by refusing to believe it could possibly be true. And the thing that made them refuse was the very same thing that had made them confident in the first place. The number 159 quintillion. They had done the arithmetic was correct, and the arithmetic told them the cipher could not be read. So when the evidence began to pile up that the enemy somehow always knew where the U-boats were waiting, the German command did not conclude that the impossible had happened. They concluded that something else was going on, because the something else, however unlikely, was still more believable to them than beating a number that large. This was not a one-time lapse. It happened again and again across years, in a pattern that should genuinely disturb anyone who likes to believe that's smart. Motivated people will follow the evidence to the truth. When convoys kept slipping past the wolf packs as if they could see them coming, the German Navy launched investigations into its own security. More than once. Senior officers, including the commander of the U-boat fleet, Karl Dönitz, ordered formal inquiries into whether their communications were compromised. And every single time, the inquiry came back with the same answer. Enigma is secure. The cipher cannot be broken. The losses must be explained some other way. They blamed spies inside their own ranks. They blamed treason. They blamed Allied radar, which was real and which did account for some of it, giving them a convenient and partially true explanation that let them avoid the unbearable one. They blamed superior Allied reconnaissance aircraft. They suspected sabotage, leaks, agents in the ports. They suspected, at various points, almost everything except the one thing that was actually happening. Because the one thing that was actually happening had been ruled out in advance by a calculation they trusted more than their own mounting losses. Think about the structure of that error, because it is not stupidity, and calling it stupidity lets us off the hook too easily. The Germans had a model of reality, and the model said the cipher was unbreakable, and the model was built on real mathematics that was genuinely correct as far as it went. So every piece of evidence that contradicted the model was forced, by the model itself, to be interpreted as something other than what it was. The stronger the evidence got, the more elaborate the alternative explanations had to become, and the more committed they grew to the alternatives. Because to accept the simple explanation would have meant admitting that the foundation of their entire communication security was rubble. A bureaucracy almost never chooses to believe that its foundation is rubble. It will believe in traitors first. It will believe in bad luck first. It will reorganize its entire picture of the war around anything at all, rather than the single fact sitting in the center of the room. And here is the part that should follow you out of this story, because it is not really about the Germans. It is the exact same failure, running in the opposite direction, as the statisticians who could not believe in Bayesian inference. Both groups had a model that told them what was possible, and both groups used the model to reject the evidence that the model was wrong, and both groups were running, the entire time, on the very machinery whose verdict they were refusing to accept. The Germans inferred their way to the conclusion that inference could not be beating them. They updated their beliefs about everything except the belief that mattered. This is also where I want to correct a flattering little myth, because the surviving audience deserves the sharper version. The story is often told that the Germans simply got sloppy, that lazy operators with predictable habits handed Bletchley the brakes, and that careless human error defeated a sound machine. There is truth in it. The operators were predictable, the cribs were real, The procedural shortcuts were exploited ruthlessly. But the deeper failure was not sloppiness. Sloppiness can be fixed with discipline. The deeper failure was unfalsifiable confidence, an institutional certainty so well armored by correct mathematics that no amount of contrary evidence could penetrate it. That cannot be fixed with discipline, because it does not feel like a mistake from the inside. It feels like rigor. It feels like refusing to panic. It feels like exactly the kind of clear-headed quantitative thinking that is supposed to protect you from error, right up until the moment it becomes the thing that destroys you. The Germans were not undone by carelessness. They were undone by a calculation they were too proud and too correct to doubt. This is the point where I have to deal directly with the claim in the title of this very piece, because you may have been waiting for it, and because the truth is more interesting than the myth, and I would rather hand you the truth. The story is sometimes told that Winston Churchill, the British state, the establishment, destroyed the evidence of what Turing did, that the machines were smashed and the records burned in some act of ingratitude or cover-up aimed at erasing the man and his achievement. The reality is almost the opposite, and the gap between the myth and the reality is itself the real scandal. So stay with me. Churchill was not the destroyer of Bletchley Park. He was its protector, its single most important champion at the highest level of government. He visited the site on the 6th of September 1941 and spoke to the staff, and he understood, in a way that frankly few politicians of any era would have, exactly how much the strange collection of mathematicians and chess players and crossword champions in those huts was worth. He is supposed to have called them the geese that laid the golden eggs and never cackled, a line whose exact origin historians debate, but whose sentiment is well documented. And there is a single piece of paper that proves his commitment beyond any argument, and it is one of my favorite documents of the entire war. In October of 1941, Bletchley Park was drowning, not in cryptographic difficulty, but in bureaucracy. The operation was desperately short of staff and resources, and the requests for more were vanishing into the machinery of military administration, deprioritized behind 100 other urgent things. So 4 of the senior codebreakers did something close to insubordinate. Alan Turing, Gordon Welchman, Hugh Alexander, and Stuart Milner Barry wrote a letter directly to the Prime Minister, going over the heads of the entire chain of command, and Milner Barry personally took the train to London and hand-delivered it to 10 Downing Street. They laid out plainly what they were achieving and what they were being starved of. Churchill read it, and on the 21st of October 1941, he sent a minute to his chief of staff with 4 words written across the top in his own hand. 4 words that carried his highest priority label: action this day. The instruction underneath read, make sure they have all they want on extreme priority and report to me that this has been done. The resources flowed almost immediately. One of the 4 men later wrote that the rough ways began miraculously to be made smooth. The most powerful man in the country had reached down into an obscure cipher operation and personally cleared its path because he understood what it was worth. So no, Churchill did not destroy the evidence to bury Turing. But here is the genuinely uncomfortable truth, the thing that is worse than the myth, in a way the myth never captures. Destruction did happen. It just happened for a reason that is harder to be angry at, and somehow more chilling for that. After the war, much of the physical apparatus of the code-breaking effort was deliberately dismantled and destroyed, and the people who had built it and run it were bound to lifelong silence. Not out of ingratitude, but precisely because the secret was still too valuable to give up. The machines were broken apart. Most of the 210 bombs were dismantled, the drums pulled off, the wiring scrapped, until no original wartime bomb survived at all. And the working machine you can see at Bletchley today is a painstaking modern reconstruction. The more advanced Colossus machines, the ones built for the Lorenz cipher, were mostly broken up on government orders that are widely attributed to Churchill himself, with all but a couple destroyed and their very existence kept secret for decades. The engineer who designed Colossus, a brilliant, self-taught man named Tommy Flowers, was ordered to destroy the blueprints, and he did. He took the plans for the first programmable electronic computer ever built, a machine he had created largely on his own initiative and partly with his own money, and he burned them in a furnace. And he called it, late in his life, a terrible mistake. He was never properly credited in his lifetime for building the machine that arguably began the computer age, because the machine was a secret, and he had burned the proof with his own hands because his country told him to. And the reason for all of it, the reason for the destruction and the silence and the erasure, was coldly logical. Enigma-type cipher machines did not vanish when Germany surrendered. Britain captured thousands of them and, in the years after the war, quietly distributed them to other governments and former colonies, recommending them as secure systems for protecting state secrets. Think carefully about what that means. The British knew those machines were breakable. They had spent the war breaking them, and they deliberately encouraged other nations to trust their secrets to the very cipher Britain could read, so that Britain could go on reading the private communications of friends and rivals alike for years into the Cold War. The whole achievement had to stay buried, not to hide a failure, but to protect an ongoing, active, enormously valuable intelligence advantage. The greatest analytical triumph of the war was classified for the same reason a magician never explains the trick. The moment you reveal how it is done, it stops working. So the silence held. It held with a completeness that is almost impossible to imagine in our own age. Around 10,000 people worked at Bletchley Park and its outstations at the peak. The official figure for January of 1945 is 8,995, and roughly 3/4 of them were women. Nearly 10,000 people who knew, in whole or in part, the most important secret of the war, and for 30 years, essentially all of them said nothing. Wives did not tell husbands. Husbands did not tell wives. Parents went to their graves without their own children knowing what they had done. People who had spent the most intense years of their lives doing work of world historical importance let their families believe they had spent the war doing clerical filing, and they kept that lie going for 3 decades, many of them dying before they were ever permitted to tell the truth. The secret did not begin to surface until 1974, when a former intelligence officer named Frederick Winterbotham published a book called The Ultra Secret, written largely from memory and wrong about many of the technical details, but enough to crack the silence open at last. By then, the man at the center of it had been dead for 20 years. He had died, in fact, in disgrace, convicted as a criminal, unable to defend himself by pointing to what he had done for his country. Because what he had done for his country was a secret he was legally bound to take to his grave. And he very nearly did. To feel the full weight of how Alan Turing died, you have to go back to how he first learned that minds can be lost, because the two events rhyme across his entire life in a way that is almost unbearable to look at directly. He was born on the 23rd of June 1912, and as a teenager at Sherborne School, he was the kind of boy the English public school system was practically designed to crush: solitary, awkward, obsessed with mathematics and science, in an institution that prized neither. His handwriting terrible, his shirts untucked, his mind already somewhere the curriculum could not follow. And then, In that environment, he found one person who understood him. A boy named Christopher Morcom, a year ahead, brilliant in the same way Turing was brilliant. The first person Turing had ever met who could meet him on his own ground. They studied together. They wrote to each other about physics and astronomy. Turing, by every account including his own, fell completely in love, though in the coded and unspoken way that was the only way available to him, and Morcom became the fixed point around which the young Turing's inner life organized itself. On the 13th of February 1930, Christopher Morcom died. He was 18. The cause was bovine tuberculosis, contracted years earlier from infected milk, a slow infection that finally took him. Turing was devastated in a way that reshaped him permanently. And here is the thing he did with the grief. The thing that I think explains everything that came after. He began to think, seriously and obsessively, about whether the mind survives the death of the body. He wrote essays wrestling with it. He wrestled with whether the spirit was separate from matter, whether the structure of a mind, the thing that made Christopher, could persist once the physical brain was gone, or whether mind was simply something the body did, a process running on machinery that stopped completely when the machinery stopped. A grieving 19-year-old, trying to reason his way to whether the person he loved still existed in any form anywhere. And the question he was really asking, underneath the grief, was the question that would define his entire scientific life. Is a mind a thing, or is it a process? Is thinking something a soul does, or is it something a machine does? He did not know it yet, but he was going to spend the rest of his life answering that question. And the answer he arrived at is the reason we live in the world we live in now. That is the man who walked into Bletchley Park, not a cold calculating machine of a person, the way he is sometimes flattened in the retellings, but someone who had built his entire intellectual project on the back of a profound personal loss, who had asked whether mind could be reduced to mechanism because he desperately needed to know whether a particular mind had truly ended. He ran for relief, sometimes covering the 40 miles to London on foot when there was a meeting, fast enough that he was later of near Olympic standard as a marathon runner. He was, by the standards of his time and place, relatively open about being homosexual among the people he trusted, in an era when that openness was not eccentricity but a criminal risk he was choosing to take. And he was, in the assessment of essentially everyone who has studied the period, one of the small handful of people most responsible for the Allied victory, through the bomb, through Hut 8, through Banburismus, through the relentless application of a kind of reasoning the world was not ready to credit. The war ended, the secret descended, and Turing went on to do the other work, the work that in the very long run may matter even more than the code-breaking, building early computers and writing the founding documents of artificial intelligence, which we will reach in a moment. He was a man with a knighthood's worth of achievement to his name, none of which the public could be told about. And then, in 1952, the same state he had saved destroyed him for the crime of who he loved. It began with a burglary. Turing's house in Manchester was broken into, and during the police investigation, it emerged that he had been in a relationship with a young man named Arnold Murray. Turing, with a kind of naivety that is heartbreaking in someone so intelligent, did not hide it. He more or less told the police the truth, apparently not grasping that he was confessing to a crime. Under a law dating from 1885, the same statute under which Oscar Wilde had been ruined half a century earlier, homosexual acts between men were illegal in Britain, and Turing was charged with gross indecency. He was tried on the 31st of March 1952, and he was convicted. There was no question of his guilt under the law as it stood. He had done what the law forbade, and the law did not care what else he had done. He was given a choice: prison or probation conditional on submitting to a course of hormone treatment, a chemical intervention meant to suppress his sex drive, what we would now call chemical castration. He chose the treatment to stay out of prison and to keep working. For a year he was injected with synthetic oestrogen. It changed his body. It caused him to grow breast tissue. It did to a marathon runner's physiology things that he bore with what observers described as a grim, ironic stoicism, making bleak jokes about it. But the humiliation was total, and it was state-administered. And there was a second blow, quieter, but in some ways worse. The conviction made him a security risk in the paranoid logic of the early Cold War. He lost his clearance. He was quietly cut off from the secret intelligence work he had continued to consult on, the work he had been better at than almost anyone alive. The country he had saved decided that the man who saved it could not be trusted because of his sexuality and pushed him out into the cold. And he could not say a word in his own defense, because the thing that would have defended him, the scale of what he had done, was itself a state secret he was forbidden to invoke. Imagine that, with the full force it deserves. He was being punished and discarded by the very institution whose existence he had helped preserve, and the proof of his value was locked in a vault with his own signature on the secrecy agreement. On the 8th of June 1954, Alan Turing was found dead in his bed by his housekeeper. He was 41 years old. The cause of death was cyanide poisoning. Beside the bed was a partly eaten apple. The inquest recorded a verdict of suicide, concluding that he had eaten an apple laced with cyanide, possibly a private and characteristically theatrical reference to a scene from the film Snow White, a story he was known to be fond of, in which a poisoned apple brings a kind of sleeping death. But even this, even the manner of his death, is not as settled as the legend insists. And the honest version leaves you with less certainty and more ache, not more. The apple beside the bed was never actually tested for cyanide. That basic step was simply not taken. His biographer Andrew Hodges reads the death as a suicide, possibly arranged so that his mother could believe it was an accident, an act of dark consideration from a son to a parent. But the scholar Jack Good's contemporary, the philosopher and Turing scholar Jack Copeland, has argued forcefully that the evidence does not actually support a confident verdict of suicide at all. Turing kept a small home laboratory where he conducted electroplating experiments using cyanide in a room adjoining his bedroom with poor ventilation. He had a habit of eating an apple before bed, often leaving it half-finished. Copeland's argument is that accidental inhalation of cyanide fumes or accidental contamination is at least as consistent with the facts as suicide, and that a poorly conducted investigation leapt to the conclusion that a convicted, chemically castrated homosexual must have killed himself. Because in 1954, that was the obvious story to reach for. Copeland suggests the only defensible verdict is an open one. We do not know how Alan Turing died. We know that he died, alone, disgraced, his greatest achievement classified, his body altered by court-ordered chemicals, at 41. The uncertainty about the apple is, in its way, the final cruelty. Even his death was not allowed to be clearly understood. It took the British state more than half a century to begin to reckon with what it had done. In 2009, after a public campaign, the Prime Minister Gordon Brown issued an official apology on behalf of the government, calling Turing's treatment appalling and utterly unfair, and ending with the words, "On behalf of the British government and all those who live freely thanks to Alan's work, I am very proud to say, we are sorry. You deserved so much better." In 2013, Queen Elizabeth II granted Turing a royal pardon, a rare posthumous act. And in 2017, a law informally known as Turing's Law extended pardons to the tens of thousands of other men who had been convicted under the same vicious and now repealed statutes. Men who did not have Turing's eventual fame to rescue their names, the uncounted ordinary casualties of the same machinery that ground him down. And I want to name the irony as precisely as the institutional autopsy demands, because vagueness would let everyone off the hook. The thing that destroyed Alan Turing was not a foreign enemy. The German military, whose cipher he broke, never touched him. He was destroyed by his own government, under his own country's laws, by the same chain of authority that Churchill had once reached down to protect. The state extracted from him a contribution to its survival that may have saved tens of millions of lives, swore him to permanent secrecy about it. And then, when his private life violated a prejudice encoded in law, took away his freedom to defend himself, altered his body, severed him from his work, and left him to die in circumstances his own country could not even be bothered to investigate properly. He could not be saved by his achievement, because his achievement was a secret. The very secrecy that made his work so powerful, the secrecy that let it go on quietly winning, was the thing that left him defenseless. The method had to stay hidden to keep working, and the man went down into the dark along with it. That should make you angry. I think it is supposed to make you angry, and I think the anger is correct and worth keeping. But anger is not actually where this story ends, because Turing himself, in the years between the war and his death, had already turned away from looking backward at what he had done and toward something else, something larger. A question he had been carrying since he was 19 and grieving in a school chapel. He had spent the war proving that reasoning could be reduced to mechanical procedure. He had built machines that deduced, and machines that weighed evidence and updated belief. And he had started to ask the obvious, terrifying next question out loud. If thinking is a procedure, and machines can run procedures, then what exactly is the difference between a mind and a machine? He did not ask it as a metaphor. He asked it as an engineering problem. And the answer he began to sketch is the reason that everything in this story, the impossible number, the heresy that broke it, the secrecy that buried it, has come roaring back into the center of your life, right now, in this decade, in a form Turing saw coming and almost nobody else did. The idea had come to him in 1936, before any of it, before the war, before Bletchley, when he was a 23-year-old answering a question in pure logic that had nothing to do with codes or submarines or empires. A great German mathematician, David Hilbert, had posed a challenge to the mathematical world. He asked whether there existed a definite procedure, a mechanical method that could be applied to any mathematical statement and determine, in a finite number of steps, whether it was provable. The question was called the Entscheidungsproblem, the decision problem. And on the surface, it was a technical matter for specialists in mathematical logic. Hilbert hoped the answer was yes. He dreamed of mathematics as a closed and complete machine where every truth could be reached by turning a crank. Turing answered the question, and to answer it he had to do something nobody had done before. He had to define, with absolute precision, what a mechanical procedure even was. What does it actually mean to follow a definite method, step by step, with no insight or intuition required? And to pin it down, he imagined a device. An abstract machine, infinitely simple, consisting of nothing but a long tape divided into squares, a head that could read and write symbols on the tape, one square at a time, and a small table of rules telling it what to do next, based on what it currently saw. That was all. Read a symbol, consult the rule, write a symbol, move left or right, change your internal state, repeat, This stripped-down imaginary contraption, which Alonzo Church would soon name a Turing machine, was Turing's definition of computation itself. Anything that could be computed by any definite procedure at all, he argued, could be computed by one of these machines. And then he proved two things that should have shaken the world more than they did at the time. First, he proved that Hilbert was wrong, that no such universal decision procedure could exist, that there were perfectly well-posed mathematical questions that no mechanical method could ever settle. Mathematics was not a closed machine. There were truths beyond the reach of any crank. But it was the second thing, almost a side effect of the first, that turned out to matter more than the entire question he had been answering. Turing showed that you could design a single machine, a universal machine, that could read on its tape a description of any other machine and then perfectly imitate it. One device that could become any device, simply by being fed the right instructions. A machine whose behavior was not fixed by its wiring, but defined by the symbols you handed it. A machine that ran software. That is the computer. Not a computer. The computer. Every phone, every laptop, every server farm humming in the desert, training the systems that now write and draw and talk. Every single one of them is a physical realization of the universal machine Alan Turing imagined on paper in 1936 to answer an obscure question in mathematical logic. He invented the concept of the programmable computer years before the technology to build one existed, as a byproduct of proving the limits of mathematics. And then the war came, and he spent it surrounded by the most advanced calculating machinery on Earth, the bombs, and later in proximity to Colossus, the first programmable electronic computer. Watching the abstract idea take physical form under the pressure of necessity. By the time the war ended, Turing did not need to wonder whether his universal machine could be built. He had spent 6 years standing next to working pieces of it. So after the war he set out to build the real thing, a true general-purpose electronic computer running on the universal principle. And he designed one of the most ambitious early computer architectures in the world, and he worked on the machines being built at Manchester. But the hardware was almost beside the point for him. Turing had already leapt ahead to the question, the hardware only made possible to ask seriously. If a universal machine can imitate any other machine, and if the human brain is, when you strip away the sentiment, a physical system following physical rules, a kind of machine, then a universal machine should be able to imitate that too. It should be able to think. The grieving 19-year-old who had asked whether mind was a thing or a process had grown into the man building the device that could put the question to the test. In 1950 he published the paper that asked it directly in the philosophy journal Mind, titled Computing Machinery and Intelligence. It opens with a sentence of magnificent, deceptive plainness. I propose to consider the question, can machines think? And then, recognizing that the words think and machine are too loaded to argue about cleanly, he replaced the question with a test, a concrete procedure, exactly as he had once replaced Hilbert's vague notion of method with a precise machine. He called it the imitation game. We call it the Turing test. The setup is simple. A human judge holds a text conversation with two hidden partners, one a human and one a machine, and tries to tell which is which. If the machine can converse so convincingly that the judge cannot reliably distinguish it from the human being, then, Turing argued, the question of whether it is really thinking becomes empty. There is no further fact to check. If it does everything a thinking thing does, indistinguishably, then insisting it is not thinking is just a prejudice about what kind of stuff a mind is allowed to be made of. Sit with how radical that move is, and how directly it grows out of everything that came before it in this story. The whole of his wartime work had been the reduction of mind to procedure, deduction reduced to the bomb's contradiction hunting, judgment under uncertainty reduced to the accumulation of decibels. He had spent 6 years proving, in the most consequential possible laboratory, that the things minds do, reasoning, weighing evidence, deciding, could be performed by machinery following rules. The Turing test is just the philosophical conclusion of that demonstration. Stated openly at last, he was no longer breaking a cipher. He was telling you something about yourself. He was saying that the thing you do when you think, the process you experience from the inside as the very center of your being, might be exactly the kind of thing a machine can do, because it might be nothing more and nothing less than a procedure. And if that is true of the machine, the unbearable implication runs in the other direction too. It might be all that is true of you. He did not get to see whether he was right. He died 4 years after publishing that paper, in the disgrace we have already walked through, and for decades the field he founded, artificial intelligence, stumbled and overpromised and collapsed and was mocked. Going through long winters where the dream of thinking machines seemed like a naive fantasy from a more credulous age. The machines could not really converse. They could not really learn. The procedures people wrote by hand were brittle and stupid, and the Turing test looked, for half a century, like a finish line nobody was going to reach. And then something changed in the last decade and a half, and the something that changed is the exact thread we have been following this entire time, returned from the grave. The machines that finally began to learn, that began to converse and translate and recognize and predict, did not do it by following rules a programmer wrote out by hand. They did it by learning from evidence, by starting with uncertain estimates and updating them over and over in response to data by exactly the right amount each time, accumulating weight of evidence until their beliefs grew sharp and useful. They did it the way Turing hunted submarines. They did it with the heresy, the entire modern revolution in machine intelligence. The systems that can now hold a conversation good enough that Turing's imitation game is no longer a thought experiment, but a thing that happens millions of times a day, is built on the mathematical foundation that the statistical establishment of Turing's own lifetime had declared illegitimate. Bayesian inference, the updating of belief under uncertainty, the weighing of evidence that Turing reduced to decibels on a sheet of Banbury paper is the beating heart of how these systems work. The method nobody believed did not just win the war. It waited, and then it came back, and it built the thinking machines. I told you to remember Jack Good, Turing's statistical assistant, the man who spent his life carrying the Bayesian flame. I told you he would say something near the end of this story that would make the hair stand up on your arms. Here it is. In 1965, Good, having absorbed from Turing both the Bayesian way of reasoning and the conviction that minds are machines, wrote a short paper speculating about what happens when you build a machine that is genuinely better than humans at the one task that matters most, the task of designing machines. He wrote, "Let an ultra-intelligent machine be defined as a machine that can far surpass all the intellectual activities of any man, however clever. Since the design of machines is one of these intellectual activities, an ultra-intelligent machine could design even better machines. There would then unquestionably be an intelligence explosion, and the intelligence of man would be left far behind." And then Good wrote the line that has echoed through every serious discussion of artificial intelligence in the 60 years since. Thus, the first ultra-intelligent machine is the last invention that man need ever make. That sentence was written by the man who sat next to Alan Turing in Hut 8 and watched him weigh evidence to find submarines. The thread runs unbroken. From a grieving boy asking whether a dead friend's mind still existed, to a young logician defining computation to answer a question about the limits of mathematics, to a codebreaker reducing reasoning to mechanical procedure to beat an impossible number, to a philosopher asking whether the machine could think, to his own assistant warning that the thinking machine might be the last thing we ever build. It is one continuous idea, pursued by the same small circle of people, hidden for 30 years, and it has arrived in our time at the exact destination they pointed toward. We are now building the ultra-intelligent machine. We are building it on the Bayesian foundation Turing used and good defended. And we are doing it while still not fully admitting to ourselves what these men understood, which is that if they were right about what a mind is, then the machine is not imitating us. It is doing the same thing we are. The difference is only one of degree, and the degree is closing. Now I have to bring this all the way home to you, because the fault line's promise is that the implication does not stay in the history books, and this one does not have the decency to stay anywhere. It is already inside your skull. Here is the question that should keep you up tonight, and I am going to build it carefully so it lands with its full weight rather than as a cheap shock. Turing reduced reasoning under uncertainty to a procedure. Take in evidence, weigh it as decibels, update your belief by exactly that amount. Repeat, he treated it as an external tool, a method you apply to a problem like Enigma. But over the last 30 years, a growing body of neuroscience and cognitive science has arrived at a deeply uncomfortable conclusion about what your brain is actually doing every waking second. And the conclusion is that your brain is running Turing's method on you, constantly, without your permission and almost entirely outside your awareness. The framework is sometimes called the Bayesian brain, and in its more radical form it goes by the name predictive processing, associated strongly with the neuroscientist Carl Friston, whose work on what he calls the free energy principle is among the most cited in modern neuroscience. The core claim is this: your brain does not passively receive the world through your senses, like a camera recording what is in front of it. That is the folk picture, and the folk picture is wrong, and it is wrong in exactly the direction Turing pointed. Instead, your brain is a prediction engine. It holds a model of the world, a set of beliefs about what is out there and what is about to happen. And at every instant it uses that model to predict what your senses are about to report. Then it compares the prediction to what actually arrives. The only thing it really pays attention to is the difference, the error, the gap between what it expected and what it got. And it uses that error to update the model by precisely the amount the reliability of the evidence justifies before making the next prediction. Take in evidence. Weigh it. Update belief. Repeat. The thing you call perception, the seamless experience of simply seeing the room you are in, is not a recording. It is the brain's best current hypothesis about the causes of its sensory input. A hypothesis it is continuously refining through Bayesian updating, the exact procedure Turing used to find U-boats, running in your head right now, generating the world you think you are simply observing. Think about what that means for the most basic fact of your existence. You feel like you are in direct contact with reality. You are not. You have never been. You are in contact with your brain's prediction of reality, a model updated against sensory evidence according to a procedure a codebreaker formalized to attack a cipher. The room around you is a controlled hallucination, in the phrase some researchers actually use, a guess so good and so constantly corrected that it feels like raw truth. When you misjudge a step in the dark, when an optical illusion fools you, when you hear your name in a noise that did not contain it, you are catching your own Bayesian machinery in the act, watching it commit to a prediction the evidence did not quite support. The errors are the only time you ever glimpse the machine. The rest of the time it is too good at its job for you to notice it is running at all. And this is where the whole story folds back on itself with a kind of horrible symmetry. So stay with me through the turn. The reasoning that the statistical establishment rejected as illegitimate, too subjective, not real science. The reasoning Turing had to use in secret and could never defend in public. Turns out, if the predictive processing people are even roughly right, to be the literal operating principle of the human mind. The experts who declared Bayesian inference an embarrassing relic were running on Bayesian inference while they declared it. They were updating their priors against the evidence of their own seminars in order to conclude that updating priors against evidence was not how knowledge should work. The method nobody believed was the method doing the disbelieving. There has never been a stranger case of a truth being rejected by the very instrument that was using it to do the rejecting. I said I personally find some of this hard to think about, and I meant it, so let me admit the place where I lose my footing. We tend to comfort ourselves when the topic of thinking machines comes up, with the idea that whatever the machines are doing, it is not what we are doing. They are just statistics, we say. Just prediction. Just weighing probabilities and updating. Not real understanding. Not like us. But every word of that dismissal is a description of your own brain. Just prediction. Just weighing probabilities and updating. The thing we point to in the machine to prove it is not really thinking, is the thing the neuroscience increasingly says we are. Turing saw this coming. He saw that once you understand reasoning as a procedure, the comforting wall between mind and machine does not get higher. It gets thinner, and then it gets transparent, and then you realize you cannot find it at all. And you are standing where you always assumed the wall was, looking at a machine that updates its beliefs against evidence, and you cannot point to a single thing it does that your own brain does not also do. This is not mysticism, and I am not telling you that computers have souls, or that you are living in a simulation, or any of the comfortable science fiction that lets you file the discomfort under entertainment. I am telling you something narrower and harder. The specific mathematical procedure that one man used in secret to break the unbreakable cipher. The procedure a whole field had ruled out of bounds is the same procedure that now runs the artificial systems we are racing to make more intelligent than ourselves. And it appears to be the same procedure that runs the 3 pounds of tissue you are using to consider this sentence. 3 things that we like to keep in 3 separate boxes. The code breaker's trick, the machine's intelligence, and the human mind turn out to be running the same algorithm. The boxes were never really separate. We just could not see the wiring, because the wiring was classified, and then it was unfashionable, and then it was so deep inside us that we mistook it for the self. And now consider the secrecy again, the 30 years of silence, the burned blueprints, the men who died without telling their wives, the apple nobody tested. In light of all this, because the secrecy was never incidental, it was structural, and it points at the final, coldest idea in this whole story. The reason the method had to stay secret was that its power depended entirely on the enemy not knowing it was being used. The instant the Germans had understood that their cipher was being read by accumulating weight of evidence, they would have changed the cipher, and the power would have evaporated. The most consequential reasoning of the 20th century could only function in the dark. To be useful, it had to be unknown. Knowledge that destroys itself the moment it is shared. And so the people who possessed the single strongest argument in the world for how minds should reason were forced to watch their argument be dismissed, and could say nothing, because to say it was to lose it. The truth was real, it was proven, it was saving lives by the million, and it had to masquerade as something that did not exist. That is not a story about one cruel government. That is a structural feature of a certain kind of power and we should sit with the possibility that it has not gone away. I asked you, near the beginning, to keep count of the people who do the impossible thing and then slip out of the story, and I want to collect the count now, because the pattern is not decoration, it is the argument. Marian Rejewski reached into a sealed machine with pure algebra and read the mind of an empire 7 years before the war, and spent his later life as an accountant in a cable factory, his name known to almost no one until he was an old man. Gordon Welchman added the single piece of wiring that turned the bomb from a fragile prototype into a war-winning weapon, and after the war. When he wrote a book in the 1980s finally describing what he had done, his own government and the American security agencies turned on him, stripped his clearance, and treated him as a traitor for revealing decades-old methods, and he died embittered, punished for telling the truth about his own achievement. Tommy Flowers built the first programmable electronic computer and burned its blueprints on the orders of the state, and went back to ordinary engineering work, unable to convince anyone of what he had done because the proof was ash. And Alan Turing, who tied it all together, was chemically castrated and died alone with an untested apple by his bed. 4 men. 4 reaches into the impossible. And the same outcome 4 times: erasure, dismissal, punishment, or worse. Not because their work failed, but because their work succeeded so completely that it had to be hidden, and the hiding swallowed them along with it. This is the institutional autopsy, and I want to be forensically clear about the mechanism rather than waving at conspiracy, because there was no conspiracy. There was something more durable than a conspiracy. There was a structure in which the most valuable possible knowledge was also the knowledge that most needed to stay secret, and in which the individuals who produced it were therefore the individuals most dangerous to leave free to speak. And the structure ground them down with the impersonal efficiency of a machine following its own rules. Nobody had to hate Turing for the machinery to destroy him. The machinery did not need hatred. It only needed secrecy and a law, and the absence of anyone with the standing to make an exception. This is also the moment to correct the version of the story almost everyone now carries, because almost nobody learned this history from the documents. They learned it from a film, and the film, for all that it put Turing's name back into the world, lied in ways that matter. The popular movie about Turing invents a security officer and a fellow codebreaker turned Soviet spy and stitches them into a tale of Turing covering for treason, an episode that essentially did not happen, with the 2 men almost certainly never even meeting and working in different sections entirely. It turns Commander Alistair Denniston, the very man who went to Poland and helped bring the gift of Pyrie back to Britain, into a small-minded bureaucratic villain trying to shut the project down, a portrayal his descendants publicly objected to, and rightly, because it inverts what the man actually did. It compresses the Polish contribution and Welchman and the entire team into the image of a lone tortured genius building a machine in defiance of everyone around him. The truth that this was a vast collaborative achievement standing on a Polish foundation, refined by Welchman, fueled by sailors who drowned for codebooks, run by thousands of women whose names we will never fully recover, is both less cinematic and far more important, because the lone genius myth is exactly the story that lets the structure off the hook. If it was one extraordinary man, then his destruction was a one-time tragedy. If it was a structure, then the structure is still here. And the structure is still here. That is the part I cannot stop thinking about. The part that drags this whole story out of 1954 and sets it down in the room with you. We are, at this very moment, building the thinking machines that Turing predicted and Jack Good warned about. We are building them on the Bayesian foundation that runs through this entire story like a buried cable. And we are building them under conditions that should feel uncomfortably familiar by now. The most advanced systems are developed behind walls, their full capabilities held as closely guarded secrets, their inner workings understood completely by almost no one, including, increasingly, the people who build them. The reasoning that powers them is so valuable that revealing too much about it changes the game, exactly as revealing the Bayesian attack on Enigma would have changed the game. We are once again in a situation where the most consequential reasoning of an era is being developed in the dark, where the power depends partly on the secrecy, and where the individuals at the center of it are being shaped and consumed by institutions far larger than themselves. The names will be different. Some of them will be erased the same way. The pattern that took Rejewski and Welchman and Flowers and Turing was never about those four men specifically. It was about what happens when knowledge becomes that powerful and that secret at the same time. There is no reason at all to think we have escaped it. There is every reason to think we are inside it again, right now, and that we will only be allowed to understand what is being built long after the people building it are beyond our ability to thank or to blame. So let me draw the last connection, the one that closes the loop all the way back to the impossible number we started with, because it is the connection that should genuinely disturb you, and it is true. The Germans trusted Enigma because they believed no amount of searching could beat 159 quintillion. They were right about searching and wrong about the world, because the world contained a kind of reasoning that does not search. It infers. It does not check every possibility. It weighs evidence and moves toward the truth without ever examining most of the space at all, the way you recognize a friend's face in a crowd without consciously comparing it to every face you have ever seen, the way your brain settles on what the room is without testing every hypothesis about what the room might be. Inference beats search. That was the secret. That was always the secret. And it is the same secret that lets a modern machine, which cannot possibly examine every sentence that could follow the words you just heard, nonetheless produce the next word, by inference, by weighing evidence, by updating belief. The thing that broke the unbreakable cipher and the thing that powers the machine that is arguably about to outthink us are not similar. They are identical. They are the same idea, and it is the idea Turing carried from a school chapel where he grieved a dead boy, all the way to the founding of a science that may not leave us at the top of the intellectual food chain for very much longer. I want to go back, one last time, to the chapel, to the 19-year-old who started all of this without knowing he was starting anything. Because the question Turing asked after Christopher Morcom died was not really a question about codes or computers or artificial intelligence. It was a question about whether a mind is a thing or a process, and he spent the next 24 years answering it, and the answer he built has a verdict hidden inside it that I do not think he ever stated out loud. And that I find almost too heavy to say plainly. But this channel does not do the comfortable version, so here it is. If a mind is a thing, a substance, a soul, some special stuff that the body merely houses, then there is room for hope. Things can be moved. Things can persist. A thing can leave when the body fails and go somewhere, which is what the grieving boy in the chapel wanted to believe. What he wrote his anguished essays trying to believe, that the part of Christopher that mattered had not simply stopped. But everything Turing did with the rest of his life was a sustained, brilliant, world-altering demonstration that a mind is not a thing. A mind is a process. It is an algorithm running on a substrate, a pattern of inference, the weighing of evidence, and the updating of belief, executed by machinery, whether that machinery is made of neurons or of rotors and wire or of silicon. And a process is not the kind of thing that can leave. When the machinery stops, the process stops. There is no remainder. The pattern that was Christopher Morcom did not go anywhere when his body failed, because it was never a thing that could go anywhere. It was something his brain was doing, and when his brain stopped, the doing stopped, completely and forever. Turing spent his life proving, with the full rigor of mathematics and the full evidence of a war, the precise thing that the boy in the chapel could not bear. He answered his own deepest hope by demonstrating it was false, and the same verdict falls on Turing himself, and on everyone he loved, and on you. Whatever you are not a thing that has a process. You are the process. The continuous act of prediction and correction, the model updating itself against the evidence moment by moment, the inference that conjures the room around you, and the self that seems to sit at the center of it. That activity is not something you have. It is what you are, entirely, with nothing left over, and it runs only as long as the machinery runs, and then it does not run anymore. This is the answer Turing's life delivered, and it is the answer the neuroscience keeps confirming, and there is no version of it that ends with the part of you that matters going somewhere safe. The codebreaker broke one more cipher than he ever admitted to. He broke the one that protects us from knowing exactly what we are. But follow it one step further, because the same blade cuts both ways, and the second edge is stranger than the first. If a mind is a process and not a thing, then it is not bound to any particular machinery. A process can, in principle, run anywhere the steps can be carried out. This is the whole logic of the universal machine, the device that can become any other device by being fed its description. It is the logic that says the same computation can run on rotors or valves or silicon and still be the same computation, which means that the very discovery that kills the soul, the discovery that you are a process rather than a thing, is also the discovery that the process is, at least in theory, repeatable, detachable from its origin, able to run on something other than the meat it started in. The thing that says you will end when your machinery ends is the same thing that says the pattern, in principle, need not have ended with that machinery at all. Turing did not get to resolve that tension, and neither do we. He left it sitting there, a wound and a door in the same sentence, and then he died before anyone could ask him which one he thought it really was. And now we are building machines that run the process. Not the same process that is you, not yet, maybe not ever, but the same kind of process, the same inference, the same weighing and updating, the heresy made of electricity, getting better at the thing you thought only you could do, in rooms you are not allowed to see, at a pace nobody fully controls. The question the boy asked in the chapel, whether a mind can survive the failure of the body that hosts it, whether the pattern can outlast the machine, was never answered. It was deferred, and it has come back to us, in our lifetime, not as a religious comfort, but as an engineering question, asked by the descendants of the same idea, in the labs building the descendants of the same machine. So here is where we end, and I am not going to make it okay, because it is not okay, and because pretending otherwise would betray everything these people actually found. The German High Command was not being arrogant. Go back and sit with that, now that you know what it means. They had 159 quintillion settings and the cold mathematics of search on their side, and they were right. And it did not matter, because the universe turned out to contain a way of knowing that does not search. It infers. It weighs the faint evidence and moves toward the truth without ever looking at most of the possibilities, and it was sitting inside the heads of a few mathematicians and inside the long sheets of paper printed in a market town, and inside, it now appears, the skull of every human being who has ever lived, including the ones who spent the 20th century insisting it was not real. The strongest thing in the story was the thing the experts said did not work. It broke the cipher. It shortened the war by years. It spared a number of lives we cannot even count without flinching. It built the computer and then the thinking machine, and it appears to be the literal mechanism of your own mind. And through all of it, for 30 years, it had to pretend it did not exist in order to keep working. The most powerful reasoning we have ever found could only operate in the dark. The man who carried it furthest was punished by the country he saved for the crime of loving the wrong person in a way the country could not be told he had saved it. They altered his body with chemicals a court prescribed. They cut him off from the only work that had ever fully used him. And on a June morning in 1954, they found him dead at 41, with an apple beside the bed that no one bothered to test, so that even now, 70 years later, we cannot say with certainty whether the man who taught the world that minds are machines chose to switch his own off, or whether it was an accident in a badly ventilated room, or whether it was something else entirely. The single most important question about the end of his life, did he do it on purpose, has the same answer as the deepest question he ever asked about Christopher Morcom, the same answer as the question of what survives when the machinery stops. We do not know. We were not allowed to look closely enough in time. And the uncertainty is not a gap that better history will someday fill. It is the permanent shape of what was done to him. He proved that you are not a thing. He proved that you are a process, an act of inference running on machinery that will one day stop, and that when it stops there will be no remainder, no part of the pattern that lifts free and goes somewhere safe. Because the pattern was never that kind of thing. And in the same breath, with the same idea, he proved that the process is not bound to the machinery it started in, that the pattern could in principle run on something else, that the wall between you and the machine was never really there. He left us holding both halves of that, and he did not tell us which one to believe. And then the machinery that was Alan Turing stopped. And the process that was Alan Turing ended, and the only thing of him that ran on into the future was the idea itself, copied out of his dying brain and into the world, into the computers and the code-breaking and the artificial minds we are building right now in rooms we cannot see. The method nobody believed is running this sentence into your ears. It is running behind your eyes as you decide whether to believe it. It found the submarines, and it found the next word, and it is, if the science is right, the thing that is finding the meaning in these words for you at this exact moment, weighing the evidence, updating what you think you are. You came here to learn how a brilliant man broke an impossible code. What he actually broke was the comfortable distance between you and the machine. There is no distance. There never was. You are the thing he discovered. And the apple was never tested.